As we get ready for the Easter season in the Christian church, we want to spend at least some time thinking about the nature of the resurrection and why we believe the resurrection to be true and why the resurrection is important. Because clearly, the resurrection is the most important event in Christianity. It's important because the resurrection is the center of all theology. As you read through the New Testament, you will time and time again find either direct or indirect references to the resurrection. You will find Paul saying things like, "If Jesus is not raised from the dead, then we are of all people most miserable." It's not just the center of theology, it's the center of Christian practice. There is no more humble act than God taking on flesh and eventually agreeing to die on behalf of his people. It's also the center of apologetics. That is, if the resurrection is true, then Christianity is true. Jesus comes to earth, claims to be God, dies the way that he had said he was going to die, and then is resurrected from the dead. If that is true, then Christianity is true. Because there were a lot of other people who claimed to be the Messiah, a lot of other people who claimed that they were sent from God, but none of them were raised from the dead. But I think it's important when we enter into a discussion like this that we remember that no one is argued into the kingdom. That is, maybe not no one, but very rarely is someone argued into the kingdom. Most people come to Christ because their parents lead them, or a friend, or a neighbor, and they see the graciousness of Christ through one of us. And so, in general, apologetics is really not for non-Christians. It's a helpful thing. But in general, apologetics helps us to see that our beliefs are not irrational and they are not without some substance. But there's no one that I've ever met who will say, "I came to Christianity because of a convincing argument for the existence of God." That's generally not the way that it happens. And so we need to be careful in the way that we marshal these kinds of things, not to, when we're speaking to someone who doesn't believe, not to be overbearing or proud, but to have the image of Christ. So as long as we as Christians can believe that Jesus is the Son of God who died for our sins and who was raised from the dead, then Christianity follows. That is, if these things are true, then Christianity is true. And I want us to think together for a few minutes about what I think are three important questions in terms of thinking about the resurrection. The first question is, did Jesus live? There are, and we'll talk about a couple of them, there are very few writers in the academic world who will argue that Jesus never even existed. And we'll talk about why that can't be true. The second question is, did Jesus die? It's impossible for someone to be resurrected if they didn't really die. And 200 years ago, there was a popular theory that Jesus hadn't actually died on the cross, but he had merely fainted and thus appeared to come back to life. Virtually no one believes that theory anymore. I know of one academic who believes sort of in that, but it's very, very rare because it's just almost without question that Jesus died. And then the most significant question for us is, did Jesus rise again? That is, if he died, then the fact that he rose again will be of supreme significance, particularly because he tells his disciples, "You can trust what I'm saying to you, and I will show you that you can trust what I'm saying to you because of the fact that I'm going to rise again." So let's think about the first question. Did Jesus live? There are certain critics, like G.A. Wells is one of them, and Michael Martin is the second one. They write for a publishing house called Prometheus Press. If you ever buy anything from Prometheus Press, it's a very skeptical publishing arm. It's sort of any book that's advertised, for example, in the Skeptical Inquirer, it'll usually be published by Prometheus Press. And so some of their books are good. They have books on, why the Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist and stuff like that. It's scholarly works. But they also they publish books like this. And the problem is that there's no well-trained New Testament scholar that I know of, that I've ever heard of, or that I've ever read, who will argue that Jesus didn't exist. There are a number of reasons to back this up. First of all, there are ancient sources that speak of Jesus of Nazareth. That is, outside of the New Testament. The New Testament, of course, is an ancient source. It's an ancient source that can be taken historically. But even outside of the New Testament, there are other sources. The one that almost everyone thinks of is Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian from probably right about the time of the death of Christ, or maybe shortly thereafter. And he lived until after the fall of Jerusalem. So this is what Josephus, in the sources that we have now, Josephus, this is what he says. Now there was about that time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. Now, there's a lot of serious question about what's going on here, because Josephus has been passed down to us through Christian churches and Christian copyists. As a result of that, there are essentially three alternatives in terms of seeing what Josephus is actually saying. Some will argue that Josephus never wrote this and that it was put in by some Christian copyist very early in the 3rd century or whatever. Others will argue on the exact other end of the spectrum, this is exactly what Jesus wrote. And then in the middle there are those who will say, Josephus wrote something like this, but it's not exactly what he wrote. It has certainly been modified by copyists. And the reason for this is that it just doesn't seem the sort of thing that a non-follower of Christ would write. And without going into a lot of detail, I'll just say I'm almost certain that Josephus actually wrote something like this. He did mention Jesus here, and I'll show you a reason for it in a moment. He may not have written these exact words in Greek. He may not have called him the Christ, but he probably had heard of Jesus. He had probably heard of some people who were his followers, and he had probably heard of the fact that Jesus did some kind of miracles, because that's the sort of thing that we find in a lot of ancient works. Even in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a Jewish source from about 600, you'll find mention of Jesus having been a sort of a demon-possessed worker of wonders, something like that. So another ancient source is the second part of Josephus, or a second quotation from Josephus, and this is what causes me to believe that the first section actually did mention Jesus, because here, and this is later in the same book, Antiquities, Josephus says, so he assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. So clearly, Josephus is saying here that the Jewish leadership had some problems with James, who became a follower of Jesus. Remember that James didn't follow Jesus at first, and probably didn't follow Jesus until after the resurrection. Almost certainly didn't follow Jesus until after the resurrection. And eventually James was put to death as a result of his Christianity, and Josephus is making a mention there. So that's the fact that Josephus mentions Jesus later on and doesn't say much about him indicates that he would expect his readers to remember that he had already introduced Jesus into the writing. So I think that's fair evidence to indicate that the earlier section of Josephus really does mention Jesus. There are other ancient sources, and I won't go through all of them. There are lots of them, but this is Tacitus, who talks about Nero, and he talks about the deaths of the Christians. So he, at the very least, Tacitus recognizes that there were people who were following this man Jesus, and they were, in one way or another, Nero hated them and put them to death by sort of lighting them on fire. You remember the story. Nero blamed the burning of Rome on the Christians. There are others, but rather than dealing with many more ancient sources, and of course, I'm assuming here the New Testament. You all know the New Testament speaks of Jesus as a historical figure who came, died, and was resurrected. So we're building onto that, other sorts of sources. But there are other modern scholars who speak about the existence of Jesus. This is an interesting statement from Bart Ehrman in a book, Did Jesus Exist? And essentially what Ehrman says is that only those skeptics who are not trained might doubt the fact that Jesus actually lived. And so what Ehrman is saying, and if you've probably read or at least heard of Ehrman. Ehrman started out as a fundamentalist, graduated from Moody Bible Institute, graduated from Wheaton, and then did his PhD in textual criticism under Metzger. And now describes himself as a happy atheist. So he has left the faith. He doesn't really care anything about the historicity or the faith. He cares more about just being a historian. But at any rate, Bart Ehrman is not a witness that is friendly to evangelical Christianity by any means. And yet he still says that anyone who would deny that Jesus exists is simply not well trained. They haven't spent time looking at the ancient sources. They haven't spent time looking at the New Testament and the way that it's passed down to us. And it's a strong piece of evidence coming from Ehrman. Here again is another sort of plank that we can look at, and that is the New Testament itself is ancient literature. And so every author of the New Testament wrote with the belief that Jesus existed in history. No one who's writing in the New Testament thinks of Jesus as a mythological figure. It's just, they don't. No one thinks that Jesus' resurrection wasn't a physical resurrection of the body from the grave. And toward the end, I'll tell you a couple of books that you can read that will go into great depth on this. This whole idea of the resurrection could be an entire semester course. There's all kinds of very recent work that has been done on the resurrection by scholars like N.T. Wright, Gary Habermas, Michael Licona. All of them are strongly in favor of the evidence supporting the actual resurrection. So there's no question by an unbiased historian that a man named Jesus actually existed. We don't just find out about him from the Bible. And even if we did, the Bible is an ancient work that has been passed down to us very carefully. So even if we did only find out about him from the New Testament, there are a number of authors there who are telling us that this person was a historical figure. So the second question that I think is significant is the question of, did Jesus die? If we can agree that an unbiased historian would agree that Jesus lived, then the next question is, did he actually die by crucifixion? There are a number of ancient descriptions of crucifixion. If you want to read about crucifixion, you can read Martin Hengel's work. Crucifixion is probably one of the most complete collection of descriptions of crucifixion in the ancient world. There's also a newer book by Mark Chapman of Covenant Seminary, also about crucifixion in the ancient world. And essentially, there are lots of places where crucifixion is sort of glanced over. They don't describe it as clearly as it's described in the New Testament because it was a horrid affair. And sometimes they will say something like, he was put to death in a manner not to be spoken of, or he was put to death in an obscene manner. And obscene, you remember, originally meant off-scene. So in a play, if something was obscene, it's something that had to take place not on the stage, but off to the side. You didn't see it. And that it has slowly made its way into our language as obscene, meaning something that you shouldn't see. For example, there are ancient Greek plays where a person is blinded, and it would be obscene in the ancient Greek world. You wouldn't have seen a person being blinded in an ancient Greek play. In Shakespeare, for example, in King Lear, you see a person being blinded, and if today someone were to make a movie, you would probably see a close-up of them being blinded. But it was obscene back in that time. So Josephus says about people being crucified, they were first whipped, and we learn that from the gospel. Then they were tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died, and then they were crucified before the wall of the city. So what happened was, before Jerusalem fell, the Roman army surrounded the city of Jerusalem and said to the people, come out or not. And so they just waited. And after a while they ran out of food, they ran out of water. It was a horrible, horrible time. You can read in Josephus about how horrible the siege of Jerusalem was. And some people would at night try to run out and get away from the Romans. And when they did, the Romans would capture them and torture them and eventually crucify them. And they would crucify them in all different kinds of ways for fun. That's what they did. And they did that so that anybody who was looking out would see what a terrible thing it was and would perhaps give up. Here's another description. This is from Livy, also talking about the scourge. So this person was scourged. That's what we hear in the Gospels. And to terrify others, they crucified him. That tells us something about how awful the sight of a crucified person was. That it was a method of making sure that other people didn't engage in the kind of behavior that led to this punishment. It would be sort of not exactly the same, but sort of the same as a public hanging or something like that. It would part of its necessity or part of its duty was scaring other people into thinking, well, I don't ever want that to happen to me. And so they, in theory, would not act the way that they shouldn't. There are others on the nature of crucifixion. This is probably one of the most awful descriptions outside of the New Testament. It comes from the martyrdom of Polycarp, so it's later than the New Testament. But it says, for who could fail to admire their nobility and patience, endurance, and loyalty to the master? For even when they were so torn by whips that the internal structure of their flesh was visible, as far as the inner veins and arteries, they endured so patiently that even the bystanders had pity and wept. And so that's just the scourging before the crucifixion happens. It was a terrible, terrible event. And many people didn't survive the scourging. It was just so brutal and so awful that they died during that, depending on who they were. Jesus' crucifixion is, without question, the most clearly described ancient crucifixion in history. We have things like we've just read, where crucifixions are sort of spoken about here and there, but nothing is as clearly described as Jesus' crucifixion. In the Gospels, all four of the Gospels report Jesus' death by crucifixion. And John, you remember, mentions the stabbing with the sword. And it's in John 19, 33 and 34 here. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, and they didn't break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. There's been some recent, and I say recent, in the last 200 years, work done on crucifixion. And the idea, for the most part, is that people who were crucified died of asphyxiation. That when they were hanging up by their arms, it's hard to fill your lungs, and so you had to pull yourself up or push yourself up by your legs that were nailed to the cross. And that's the reason that the Roman soldiers would break people's legs. It's because then you couldn't push yourself up anymore, and you would eventually expire from, you couldn't breathe anymore. Because some people would survive on the cross for a day or two, and you can imagine how horrid that must have been. And here, Jesus' legs aren't broken. There's one piece of archaeological evidence in the world of a crucified man. It's interesting that we only have one piece. And there's a heel bone with the nail still in it. For those of you who remember, must have been 10 or 12 years ago, at the Fort Lauderdale Museum, when they had that museum of all the biblical artifacts, they had that piece there. And it's a heel bone of a man who was crucified, and apparently the nail hit some sort of a knot in the wood or something and turned, and so they didn't pull the nail out when he was buried, so it's still there. That person's leg shows signs of being broken, and there's argument today among scholars as to whether it was broken at the crucifixion or whether it was broken later on as they took his body down and tried to bury him. But whatever, there's at least that piece of evidence showing that people were indeed crucified, and we have eyewitness accounts, so there are lots of other ideas about the crucifixion. Peter talks about Jesus dying, so we have eyewitness accounts. It's not just that we have some description of Jesus from someone 150 or 200 years later. This sermon in Acts is an eyewitness description from Peter. And Peter says, this Jesus, delivered up to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. So this sermon probably is within 2 or 3 years after the resurrection. And Peter here is preaching that Jesus was taken by lawless men and killed at their hands. You also have Paul talking about Jesus' death in his preaching. He says, explaining and proving it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. And you remember, of course, I'm sure, that Christ is not a name, it's a title. Today, we think of Jesus Christ like his last name. Like if you wanted to look him up, you'd Christ, Jesus, the way you'd probably Google it. But that's the Christ is a title, and it means Messiah or anointed. Messiah in Hebrew is anointed. Christos in Greek is anointed. So when Paul says, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ, he means he is the Messiah. And Paul is in the synagogues explaining, he says, and proving that it was necessary for Christ to suffer and die. And so one of the things that we should remember at Easter is that the New Testament doesn't say that Jesus was God in spite of the fact that he was crucified. The New Testament says Jesus was God because of the fact that he was crucified and that he rose again. That this was not some accident of government. This was the direct plan of God for Christ to suffer like that. Jesus' death is very widely accepted by historical scholars, New Testament scholars. And there are a lot of them. Bart Ehrman is one of them who will say there's no doubt that Jesus died. John Dominic Crossan, who is a member of the Jesus Seminar. And Crossan is an interesting person. If you were to ask Crossan, you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, he would say, yes. And if you pressed him on it, he would say, well, what I mean is that all the disciples believed the words of Jesus, and so Jesus lived in their hearts. He doesn't mean anything like an actual physical resurrection by that. but he will freely admit that Jesus dies. So there's virtually no question that Jesus died. There are three things that almost any carefully trained New Testament scholar will agree to about Jesus. The first is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Almost everyone will admit this. And they admit it because of something called the criterion of embarrassment. That is, it would have been embarrassing in the first century to have a leader who was crucified. A crucified Messiah was a failed Messiah. You didn't want to spread around that your Messiah had been crucified. That was his failure. That's the reason that the disciples run off. Because once Jesus is crucified, well, and we must have bet on the wrong horse. We got to do something else. Go back to fishing or whatever. Because it's just, they thought the crucified Messiah was dead. So there's no reason to make up a story that your leader died by crucifixion. The only reason that would exist is because it actually happened. A second thing that most will admit is that shortly after this death, his disciples had some kind of experience that led them to believe that Jesus was alive. If you remember years ago, about 2000, 2001, somewhere in there, Dr. Kennedy's television ministry made a film called Who Is This Jesus? And they had a variety of scholars, both skeptical scholars and evangelical scholars. And most of the skeptical scholars would say something like, I don't know what happened. It's impossible for me to know what happened, but something happened to make the disciples think that Jesus had come back from the dead. And so because of their supernaturalist bias, I would believe, they can't grant that Jesus was resurrected, but they also can't get past the evidence that seems to say something happened that made a gigantic change in a variety of people. So the third thing is that Paul, who began as an enemy of Jesus, had some kind of an experience to lead him to believe that Jesus was alive. That something happened to this very carefully trained person who hated the church and hated what the church was doing to Judaism, because at this point, Christianity was just a part of Judaism. If you had asked, like Matthew, are you a Christian or are you a Jew? He would have said, yes, I'm a Jew who believes in the Messiah, Jesus. Paul hated that. And so he, walking on the road to Damascus, I'm not sure we should call it a conversion experience, because he was already a Jew. It's a calling. Jesus Christ says, I really am the Messiah, and you need to follow me, and he does. And it's a very direct change of life for Paul. You know, he changes from this person who hated Jesus to a person who's the greatest missionary of the early church. So let's think then about these questions of how can we know that Jesus actually rose from the dead. First, there's evidence for the empty tomb. Now, the empty tomb doesn't necessarily prove that Jesus rose from the dead. There are other alternatives that could answer an empty tomb, but at the very least, it shows that something went on there. And the evidence for the empty tomb is found in all four of the Gospels, and the four Gospels reflect at least three different strands of material. So you have Mark, you have Q, and you have John. At the very least, you have three separate strands of material in the Gospels, all of them pointing to the fact that there was an empty tomb there. A second interesting thing is that Jerusalem would be the worst place to try to falsely proclaim the resurrection. This is the city in which the crucifixion and burial took place. You would think that if people are claiming that Jesus rose from the dead, they would get outside the city of Jerusalem to do it, because all that someone had to do in order to show that Jesus didn't rise from the dead was just say, look, here's his grave. Go there and look for yourself. So there's clear evidence that there was an empty tomb. The Jewish polemic, that is the Jewish argument against early Christianity, assumed an empty tomb. You see, in Matthew, the soldiers go to the chief priests, and the chief priests said to the soldiers, "Tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep." Now, there's no need for that kind of polemic if the tomb's not empty. The only reason that you need this kind of a story of a stolen body is that the tomb is empty. So we can, I think, grant that the tomb clearly is empty. And then we have eyewitnesses. And the fact that the earliest eyewitnesses to the resurrected Christ were women is problematic. Again, it goes to this criterion of embarrassment. It's problematic for two reasons. One is women in general couldn't testify in court at this time. I don't want to make that as an absolute statement, because about 12 years ago I used to say no woman could testify in court, but I found one place where a particular woman was allowed to testify in court, but it was the exception that proves the rule. It was a very, very exceptional bit of circumstances. So the fact that these women were the first ones who saw Christ is embarrassing because they couldn't give testimony. And you'll notice later on when the epistles talk about the resurrection, they don't mention the women in general. The second thing is that it makes the disciples look cowardly. The disciples are not there going to see Jesus' tomb because they're afraid. They've run away. In their minds, a crucified Messiah is a failed Messiah, and the Roman government's probably coming for them next. They don't want to be crucified, so they're going to hide out. And that's why the women are there at the tomb and the disciples aren't. There are also other kinds of eyewitnesses. The change in the disciples is an amazing thing. That they go from this group of people who are hiding for fear of death to being willing to be put to death for Christianity. And the New Testament doesn't talk about most of the death of the disciples, but Eusebius, an early church historian, does. And as far as we know, all of the disciples were put to death except for John. And John, the story is, was put into a pot of boiling oil, and through some kind of miracle he escaped. And as a result of that, he was put onto the Isle of Patmos, and it was there that he wrote Revelation. Now that's not New Testament, that's early church history, so we don't know that for absolute certain. But we are almost certainly sure that disciples died for their Christianity. And that's a very strong piece of evidence, because why die for that? If you stole Jesus' body, or if you knew that he didn't really rise from the dead, why would you not say, okay, this is enough. I've made a few bucks off this, but I'm not going to die for it. But they don't. They die in a variety of horrific ways, some of them being crucified, some of them being beheaded, some of them being drowned. And it's a strong piece of evidence, I believe, for the fact that they believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Not in some kind of a spirit, but that he actually physically rose from the dead. Now, this next piece of evidence is a little difficult, and that is Paul claims to be an eyewitness in 1 Corinthians 15, but we don't know where that eyewitness account took place. On the road to Damascus, in Paul's two accounts of his calling by Christ, he doesn't see Christ, he hears him. And we want to be careful, because if Paul had some kind of a vision of Christ, it would be different from what the apostles had, because they said that they saw the living Christ walking around eating and all of that. So I wonder if it's possible that Paul saw Jesus during the 40 days that he was walking around. We don't know. We know that Paul, that certainly is possible. Paul was in Jerusalem training under a Jewish rabbi named Gamaliel. And it may have been that someone said, you need to go and see this guy that they're saying rose from the dead. And he may have gone there as a young man and seen him. We don't know that for certain, but you'll see here in this passage in 1 Corinthians, Paul says that he actually saw Christ. And this is a very significant passage. So Paul says, I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word preached to you, unless you believe in vain. And then this is the important, significant part for our argument. For I delivered to you as first importance that what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scripture, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scripture, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, then to the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now, it may be that Paul is separating out his vision of Jesus from the others by saying, as one untimely born. We don't know. But there are reasons why this 1 Corinthians 15 passage is important. It's important, one, because it's early. 1 Corinthians was written in the mid-50s. So you have writing about the resurrection within 20 to 25 years after it happens. And it's not just that it was written early, it's that it was some sort of a poem or a creed. And you notice that Paul says, I delivered to you that which I received. So he's saying, I got this from somewhere. And it can be back translated into Aramaic. I'm told, I don't know Aramaic, so I don't want to. I'm told by scholars who do, that it can be back translated into Aramaic, and it takes on the form of a sort of a creed. Hebrew poetry didn't rhyme. You remembered it in the way that we remember, lines of things that lined up together. And that seems to be what's going on here. It seems to be something that Paul is saying actually happened, and that this event that he's talking about is what was talked about in this creed that he had gotten from somewhere else. And it names some of the eyewitnesses, right? It names Peter and James and Paul himself. And someone could go and ask them. And then it points out a large number of others who were unnamed. And so Paul is saying Jesus appeared to 500 people, he says, 500 men, so there are probably 1,000, maybe more people there. And he's saying some of them are still alive, right? He says many of whom are still alive, some who have fallen asleep. The reason he says that is, if you want to go and talk to them, you can. There's no sense in which this is some sort of a mystery religion in which you only can talk about it in a cave at night. Nothing like that. It's all done out in the open. And Paul is very clearly saying this was a real person. This was a historical event. You can go and you can talk to these people. You can ask them yourself. If you don't believe me, they saw the resurrected Christ. It was a historical event. And so, I think that we can confidently assert, 1, that Jesus lived, 2, that Jesus died, and 3, that Jesus rose again. It seems to me that if the resurrection were not a supernatural event, scholars would be as quick to accept it as they would to accept the first 2. The reason that they're unwilling to accept the third is that it's just too supernatural. And you'll hear them say things like, people don't rise from the dead. So I can't believe that. Something happened, but I don't know what it was. And it's not people rising from the dead because people don't rise from the dead. That's why they won't believe it. And yet, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is clearly just as strong as it is for his living and for his dying. And we have much more evidence for the resurrection than we do for virtually any other ancient historical event. And so if someone wants to argue we can't take New Testament seriously, it forces them virtually to become an agnostic about any ancient historical event. If there's clear evidence for any ancient historical event, there's clear evidence for the resurrection. And this is the gospel. The fact that Jesus was manifested in the flesh, that he lived a life as a human being, that he was put to death for our sins, and that he was resurrected, is the gospel. That's what we believe that everyone needs to hear. That's what we believe is the real answer to the problems of the world. And that's the reason that Knox exists. We exist to train people to go out and show those around them that we're not believing in cleverly devised fables. We're believing in the genuine, absolute historicity of an event that was seen by eyewitnesses, and those eyewitnesses left their testimony for us.